Welcome to In the Frame. I'm your host Brett Moffatt, and we have a fascinating discussion lined up for you in this episode. Our guest is Ken Auletta, an award-winning author and senior contributor for The New Yorker. Ken has authored 13 books, including 5 US national bestsellers. His work covers giants like Rupert Murdoch, Harvey Weinstein and Google, offering deep dives into media, technology and power. In this episode, we explore Ken's writing process for journalism and books, the challenges of completing a book, and the impact of the digital age on news. We'll also touch on the democratisation of information and the hurdles journalists face today. Stay tuned and settle back for an insightful conversation with one of America's premier media critics, authors and thinkers, Ken Auletta. From Australia. I apologise if you can hear crows in the background.
Is it 7 or 8?
Yeah, it's 7 in the morning here, so there's a lot of bird activity where I live. Thanks so much for joining us, Ken. You have written 12 books. Your books reflect a long game. They're not based on one-off incidents, but rather a long and patient process of research and reflection. And then the journey you take readers on is underpinned by years of painstaking research and fact-checking. How long can those books take to write?
Well, the general rule for most of my books, with one exception, which was Three Blind Mice, a book on television that came out in 1991, that took me 5 years. But the norm is about 3 years.
And is there an inkling for those stories? Are you reflecting on what's happening, or are there events that are happening at the time that you think there's a story here, there's something going on here, I need to write about this?
Oftentimes it's events unfolding before your eyes. I mean, for instance, if you take my book Googled, The End of the World as We Know It, I went back in reporting that. I spent a lot of time parked at the Google campus in Mountain View, California. And in the course of reporting that book, I told the story of the two founders of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, told the story of how they started the company. So I went back in time to do that. But then I'm in the current world and the current time where they're disrupting traditional media dramatically. And so I'm reporting that as they're doing it. So it was a moving picture story. It kept on moving. And one of the interesting challenges that you confront as an author of a book like that is what's your ending? It's still moving as you're reporting. And how do you end it? And that's always a wrestling with yourself match. But a lot of my books are not, where the person is born, has a career, and then dies. It's ongoing, and so it's an interesting challenge. And it's interesting for me to be able to interview the people who are alive and going through that period.
Absolutely, because the books that I've read a little bit from, and the articles that you've written for The New Yorker, they go into forensic detail, and I can see that you're approaching the stories from all the angles. I wondered when I read the Elizabeth Holmes profile for The New Yorker in 2014, did you have any inkling of what was to transpire with Theranos at the time when you wrote that? No,
I did not. I knew I had a sense that she was a bit of a zealot. But that could be good. I mean, Larry Page and Sergey Brin or Steve Jobs at Apple were zealots in the same way. They believed in something. They worked hard to transform the world as they knew it, and they wanted to create a new world. And I thought that's what she wanted to do. She believed that you could do a blood test from a single finger prick of blood, 1 drop of blood or 2 drops of blood, and replace that long needle that people often fear in your arm, and do it much more cheaply and quickly, and do it in drugstores, not just in a doctor's office, and do it on weekends in drugstores. It would be a transformative and very disruptive, but beneficial thing. And I think she believed that. I had no idea, frankly, that she was committing fraud, as the charges in her trial now claim. But she did tell me a number of lies, I later found out. I mean, when the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the federal government in the United States, did an investigation, and she had told me that 99% of the tests, the blood tests she did, Theranos did, which I took 2 of, were the finger prick test, 99%. The Securities and Exchange Commission report investigation found that 99% was the right figure, but 99% with a long needle. So she clearly lied to me about that, and suggested to me as well that she had a contract with the military, and Theranos would be, big contracts were coming, and she was telling that to investors who were pouring money into her, and that was not true either. So I came later to understand, it's partly because of the brilliant work that John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal did, and a book he wrote called Bad Blood, that in fact she was cutting corners, and what she said she had, she didn't have.
Yeah, and I when I read through your that profile back in 2014, there were a couple of paragraphs where you do question the veracity of her claims, because you had, I guess, cross-examined, actually interviewed peers who were questioning some of the processes involved. So when I read the story, I felt there was a little bit of doubt, even though you
there was. Oh, no question. I didn't know. I didn't believe she was fraudulent, as the prosecutors now claim, with some evidence that she was. But when I kept on pressing her, and I wrote in the 6 times I asked her, describe the process. What happens when you take the finger prick of blood and you put that little amount of blood in a nano container and put it into the machine? What happens? Describe the process that happens. And I described it, what she said to me 6 different times, as comically opaque. John Carreyrou, who said that one of the things that provoked him to and gathered his interest in reporting on her and Theranos was that line in the piece where, and I also had a line where I talked to some experts who doubted her. So there was reasons to question her in my piece, but I didn't expose her the way John Carreyrou did, and my hat's off to him for that.
Absolutely. I've read you keep. You're fastidious with your note taking, and do you have stories in parallel as these things are unfolding? Are you following numerous stories and collating notes on each of those things that are happening?
Yeah, I mean, if I, for instance, if someone tells me about an incident that took place, an anecdote, with Rupert Murdoch, who I've profiled and written about extensively over the years. And they tell me about that. And I then ask them, who else was in the room when this transpired? And they name 4 individuals. I then make a note and go out and interview 4 individuals, if I can. And so you from each individual, you gather information about the anecdote, and you use that information to provoke or to yield or draw out information from others in the meeting. Do you remember, or Tom Brokaw said this, or Rupert Murdoch's daughter Elizabeth says that? Do you remember that happening? And so from that, you can create, hopefully, an authentic picture.
Do you have a sense of how these things are going to pan out, or is your I guess your compass, your true north, the truth? You really can't write your story until it's almost over.
You do all the reporting, and let's say you've spent 2 years doing the reporting, and you've got all your tapes and all your notebooks, and you have what I call an index of all the information that I've collected. And because after I do interviews or reporting, let's say at an end of a day where I've done 4 interviews, I will then go to my desktop computer and write headlines. Rupert Murdoch says the reason he fired so-and-so is, and then I put in parentheses, that information either comes from a notebook, which I alphabetize each notebook. Notebook A, page 64, let's say, or it comes from a document, and that in documents I do numerically, or it comes from a book, and the books I do Roman numerals, and with a page after it. So, and I take voluminous notes as I'm doing the interview, but I tape all my interviews, and I have that on my with a trackball. I can follow it on my computer. So I look in the notes and I say, I want to find that part of the interview, and with my trackball, I find it, and then I literally can transcribe the paragraph or the sentence that I'm interested in. But it's a very laborious process, this indexing, and yet it's the most essential thing I do. And at the end, you wind up with hundreds of pages, single-spaced index. And like a deck of cards, you begin to shuffle it, and you say, well, let's move this over here and here. And you try and create a narrative, a story. Often it's chronological, but it may not be. What is your opening scene? What's the voice you start with in writing it? And then where do you go from there?
Yeah. Do you reflect on all of those notes? I guess they're artifacts, aren't they? They're factual pieces of information. Do you also write then reflections on some of those interviews? Because I guess, let's say, for instance, you interview someone in a bar. I guess it's not just the things they're saying, but it's their behavior and their body language, all those kinds of things, things that can't necessarily be captured in the actual recording or in your notes. Do you go home and reflect on those things as well?
Well, first of all, in your notes, you're describing the person you're interviewing. You're describing, if they take a minute before they respond, you're writing that down. And oftentimes at the end of the day, yes, you will write observations, so that you can come back to it months later and you remember. Otherwise, you risk not remembering it. And so yes, of course, you take notes later. And in reviewing your notes, you say, but wait, he's contradicting something he said here. I got to go back and ask him, or I got to ask the people he's talking about, and pursue that. So I always have little yellow pads where I'm taking ask so-and-so. And then I also have a file on my computer of questions, names of people and the questions I want to ask them.
Absolutely. It's absolutely fascinating. I find that process, which is not transparent to your readers. So it's really interesting to actually dig deeper into that process and actually what goes into those stories. What are some of the most important ingredients of a great story, do you think?
Well, anecdotes are real important. A, B, people, and getting access to them and capturing their voice and their personality, and the assumption is if you have characters, major characters in either a New Yorker story or a book, the assumption I make is that I'm going to interview this person multiple times. It's it's not going to be based on one interview. And I'm going to really be involved. I mean, for instance, I mentioned Rupert Murdoch, but when I profiled Mr. Murdoch in 1995, I spent 10 days with him in his office, mostly in Los Angeles. We had dinner 6 or 7 nights of those 10 days, just the two of us doing interviews. And I'm doing interviews asking him about Sir Keith Murdoch, his father, or his wife, or his sons and daughters. And so and oftentimes the first interview is not, what do you say to the critic who says you did this? It's, tell me about your father. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about growing up. And people love to talk about themselves. And by the way, I really want that information, because that information often unlocks keys to that person's character and personality and drive. And so the biography part is really important. But once you do an interview with someone about biography, you've created a bond with them, and they feel, you know them. And sometimes what happens is at the end of the process, when they actually read what you've written, they're disappointed and they feel betrayed. I confided in Ken. I opened up, I shared my family, my secrets, my thing, and he wrote this piece that's not positive for me. And it's a very human reaction they would have, that they would feel. And I know Murdoch, when I wrote the profile, of the 20,000 word profile of him in 1995, he felt hurt by it. He was upset. He thought it was a very negative piece. And, but again, what you're doing, you used the word truth earlier. You are searching for what you think is the truth. Now, as some famous writer once said, the truth is a liquid, not a solid. So it's an imperfect truth, maybe sometimes, but you're striving to get as close to the truth as you can. And oftentimes, the actors in a drama want to reject that truth, or they feel embarrassed by that truth, or want you to write a more favorable truth for them. And that's not my job. I don't work for them.
No. Well, I guess it's because you build up those intimate relationships. So in a way, they feel you're going to profile them in a very positive way. They think, Ken's a really nice guy. I've had a great chat to him and I've told him all this stuff. He'll write something nice. But part of your process is that you're building it all up from all different perspectives and you're speaking to other people. So the person you get to meet may not actually be the authentic. It might be the surfacey version, I guess, or the facade, or the person they're trying to promote, rather than the actual real person. But have you found anyone that's been really difficult to peg in terms of you really can't make them out, or is that why you do rely on other sources and interviewing other people?
Well, you'll always find some mysteries, even if you spend enormous number of hours with the person and interview them extensively, and you interview their family and friends. You're still often going to find, with a complicated person, you're going to find doors you can't enter, and that where there are secrets inside and mysteries inside. You do your best to get in, but I don't have subpoena power. And if I did, you may not get the answer to the mystery. So yeah, you'll always find that that people you set out to profile, there are mysteries you can't crack. I mean, when I was doing the founders of Google and the Google book, I interviewed them, but I didn't interview them as much as I wanted to, because at some point they just shut it down. Now, sometimes people will shut it down because they're not vain. They don't care. Because vanity is one of the great weapons that a journalist has. People talk because they're vain. They don't have to talk to you. Or because vanity takes many forms. It could just take the form of pride. I want people to know the amazing things I do. So therefore, I'm going to talk to Ken. That's a very understandable. But in Larry Page and Sergey Brin's case, they were billionaires by now, very successful. And as you often will find, by the way, in Silicon Valley and in the tech world, and you found it with Elizabeth Holmes, they're very secretive oftentimes. And the explanation they give as to why they're secret and closed off and not wanting to talk too much is that they're afraid they'll give things away to their competitors. That's what Elizabeth Holmes's argument was. We find in retrospect that that was a false argument, that she didn't want to open up and describe, for instance, to me what happens in that when the little nanotainer of blood is put in this machine, what actually happens. She wanted, because nothing happened. It was untrue.
Have you ever been challenged by your sense of right or wrong? Have you ever interviewed anyone and thought, "Oh, I can't really say that," or just, I guess, being challenged in terms of moving forwards on a profile or a story?
Well, if I understand the question, I've had things. I'll give you a couple examples. When I was interviewing William Paley, the founder of CBS network television, a pioneer in the 1920s, right? And he was well up in years. He was 90-ish when I interviewed him. And he had been pushed out by Larry Tisch, who had taken over CBS in 1986. So I'm interviewing Paley. And when I interviewed him about events that took place in the 1920s, the founding of CBS, he was fairly lucid. When I interviewed him about events that took place last week or last month, he wasn't. And he was saying things to me that weren't true. And I had to make a decision after that interview. Was Bill Paley lying to me, or was he losing some of his mental capacity? I ultimately concluded he was losing some of his mental capacity. So I didn't expose him as a liar, because I actually came to the view that he wasn't lying to me. He just didn't remember. And he was, just talking. Another case, I was doing a profile of someone, and I found out that their daughter, one of the things that helped shape a decision they made was that their daughter tried to commit suicide. And I said, as I thought about it, and this person told me, it was on the record, I said, I'm not going to print that, because this daughter didn't commit suicide. She's still alive. Why embarrass her? She's not the source. She's not my story. She's not the spotlight of my story. And actually, I didn't think the father should have said that to me. But on my own, I made the decision not to print that, and I'm happy I did.
Absolutely. People come to rely on trusted news outlets to receive their information, but digital publishing, the internet, and the dissolution of hard copy print media appear to have brought much deception and fake news, sponsored articles and sponsored journalism. How do you think journalism and writers can build on and retain their integrity with the constant cloud of doubt hanging over their heads? And how do you build trust as a journalist and a writer?
Well, I always say to people, I'm going to do a profile of them. My mission is to understand you. And that, if they believe that, it gives them some confidence. And I actually mean that. That's my job. Even if, when I profiled Rupert Murdoch, I had a history with him. When he did a hostile takeover of New York Magazine, I was a contributing editor there. I was one of the people who led the march. I was 28 years old to, "We'll quit if you win, Mr. Murdoch." And it was every day. It was on the front page of the newspapers in the United States. And when he won, I quit. And he knew I quit. And I'd written about him. And yet he agreed to sit with me, because I do find him a fascinating character. But I said to him, I want to try and understand him. And I set out to understand him. And the questions you ask betray whether you're really trying to understand the person or not. If I'm asking gotcha questions, that the source is going to know, well, this guy's a phony. A. B, if you do multiple interviews, you're not in it for the short term. you're in it. You're buttressing your argument that you're really trying to understand the person, because you want to come back again and again and have interviews.
Boom.
And you're not writing, the short, quick pop headline, gotcha, Rupert Murdoch did this or so-and-so did that. You really, so one of the problems we have in journalism is the form, short, quick headlines dictates the content. And the content for people who are being written about, they often perceive that the journalists are not trying to understand and just searching for a headline. And that undermines trust. But, one of the problems we have all over the world, but it's particularly acute in the United States today, is that because there's so much information, digital forms, local newspapers, magazines, television, podcasts, blogs, etc., that people can search and get their information from many different sources today. There's been a democratization of information. But that means that it's very hard to agree on what are universal facts. If I watch Fox News, which is more right-wing in the United States, I'm getting more right-wing points of view and not getting points of view, let's say, that support President Biden. If I watch MSNBC, you get a more liberal point of view television, which is more favorable to Mr. Biden and more critical of the conservatives. So, but if I just watch Fox, I'm coming away with one set of facts. If I just watch MSNBC, I come away with another set of facts. And so where's the universal fact? And so we enhance the polarization of a democracy. And it's one of the problems we're having in the United States, where, Republicans don't trust Democrats. Democrats don't trust Republicans. 80%, according to polls, of Republicans in the United States believe that Donald Trump won the election. Joe Biden did. That Donald Trump was cheated out of the election. 90-some-odd% of Democrats think that's poppycock. And it is poppycock. But if 80% of Republicans believe it's not poppycock, boy, you got a communication problem.
Absolutely.
And the press that writes about it and says it's poppycock, the people who believe Trump won and had the election stolen from them are angry with them. And I won't read you anymore. I won't watch you anymore because you're a partisan. It's a huge problem. And by the way, it goes on all over the world. I see it in Hungary. You see it in many countries in Western and Eastern Europe. And obviously, you don't have that problem in China or Russia because you don't have democratic information.
Absolutely. And I would say it's a fairly recent phenomenon too, Ken, like in probably over the last 10 to 20 years. Prior to that, prior to the internet, there were, I would assume there were more rigorous standards around some of the journalism.
Well, I don't even know there was standards question. It's if you go back 30 years, in the United States, you had three television networks. That's all. And they all had newscasts. And so if you watch television, you got your information, your national and international information from those three networks. If you watch local news, you had local broadcast stations in each. You didn't have cable and you didn't have the internet. And you had local newspapers and you had, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera. But you had limited resources or sources of information. With the birth of the internet and the decline, suddenly you're not just dealing with three networks. Murdoch came along and created a fourth network. And then you got, cable comes in with Fox and CNN and MSNBC and others and podcasts and everything else. And suddenly we're awash in information and different points of view. Now, in many ways, that's wonderful. It's democratic. It's opened up. People have a voice and they could search for the information they feel comfortable with. On the other hand, the negative is that they're searching for information they feel comfortable with, and what they feel comfortable with may not be true.
And is that where news editors have the power to create that bias in terms of, or the owners of those outlets have the power to create the bias that they're wanting to push?
They do, but you have you don't. Once upon a time, you had a relative handful of individuals with enormous media power of over information. William Randolph Hearst or Murdoch's, and Murdoch still has that in Australia, but he doesn't have it in the United States. He has influence in the United States, and oftentimes pernicious influence in the United States with Fox News and others. But there are lots of rivals, lots of different sources of information, and it's just increasingly you see, for instance, people are creating their leaving their newspapers and magazines and starting their own little newspapers without editors, and they just write directly, and you pay them $5 a month or $6 a month or $100 a year, and you can have access to your favorite writers and thinkers. But there's no one editing them. They're just out there, and there are dozens of hundreds of them, and that creates a wide variety of news sources, and it creates narrowcasting where people, I'm just going to go and get my information from this single source or these few single sources and ignore all the other stuff.
Absolutely. And a lot of it too are more opinion pieces. It doesn't have that veracity of the fact-checking process, which requires a lot of resources and time to do that. So if people are on a publishing schedule and they need to churn out stories that aren't being fact-checked, then they really are simply opinion pieces, even though they're promoted as fact, aren't they? So,
well, there's no question that with the advent of the internet and the advent of multiple sources, it places a premium on people trying to stand out. And one way you stand out is to express an opinion. And increasingly, there's no question, people are much more opinionated on television and newspapers and in their headlines. And increasingly, it used to be in the newspaper world, we worried about the power of advertisers. Are we going to send the advertisers? And the people, the publishers would worry about the advertisers and put pressure on journalists. Well, now, one of the pressures that's happening in the newspaper world is the pressure of readers, what the readers want. And for instance, in the Trump world, Trump created enormous interest. He was a colorful guy. Some would argue, a demagogue as well, who was not wedded to the truth very often. But it meant that it gave license to journalists to write about him too much. And one of the reasons they wrote about him too much is because that's what the readers wanted. So they were giving them, and as they were giving them more Trump, they were also, their circulation, their digital circulation was right, and their print circulation and their television Nielsen ratings were rising as well.
Mm. And you wrote it in your article and the book about the math men, because you compare how the old paradigm of the madmen, I guess the dream makers, has been challenged since the internet by the data crunchers, the math men, and that sort of feeds into that, doesn't it? Because the media outlets are responding to the data rather than necessarily in the past, I guess, what the madmen were trying to promote or advertise.
In the past, if you were a newspaper, if you were a publisher, 30, 40 years ago, you guessed what your readers were reading in the newspaper. And one of the tools you use to guess what they were reading is the letters to the editor they would send in, complaining about something or praising something. Well, today, with the digital world, you can measure what people read, and Facebook, you get the likes, what people actually like. And that's a powerful weapon for a publisher to have, to then go down to the newsroom and talk to his editor and say, I want more Kim Kardashian stories, because that's what the readers want. They want pictures of Kim Kardashian. They're sexy, let's have more of that. No, but we're doing this investigation on the mayor or the governor or the state legislature. It's kind of boring, and it's very expensive to do that. And it takes a lot of time, and I want some headlines. I need some juice. And that's one of the dynamics that we're living through now.
Do you feel there needs to be that balance? Because some of that other stuff, that so-called boring stuff, is actually really important. People need to read it. That doesn't necessarily mean they will read it, but some people will read it. But that information needs to get out there. So do you find there's like a balance, say in the New Yorker or other outlets? Do you feel like there is that balance of infotainment and the more factual stuff that people need to know?
I mean, I think there are a lot of, look at the New York Times, or look at what the Wall Street Journal did recently with Facebook. These institutions do long-form investigative reporting, and they know that they're not getting, if you're writing a 10,000-word multi-part in the Times that takes up 4 inside pages, or the Wall Street Journal, which takes up several inside pages, you know that many of your readers are not reading the whole thing. But you also should know that it's giving you enormous credibility as an institution and keeping people like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook or Donald Trump and his taxes on their toes. And that's a wonderful thing. Actually, we're harmed by another event that's taking place, which is the decline of local newspapers. Local newspapers often were a kind of cop on the beat, checking up on corruption and malfeasance. And increasingly, with advertising dollars going away from local newspapers to Craigslist or to Google and Facebook and Amazon, local newspapers are starved and they go out of business. And that's an enormous problem in terms of reporting on what public officials do or don't do.
It's interesting. I find sometimes that things of great value, they may disappear, but I feel as though that kind of reporting, that beat cop local reporting, will probably find another form to come through because it is so valuable. It's just, I suppose,
to do. I mean, if you want to, in order for a reporter or a team of reporters, I mean, the Washington Post did a story on what happened on January 6th at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. It was a 3-part series. They assigned 75 reporters to work on that. That's pretty expensive. And they did it over 6 or so months. Well, that's really extravagantly expensive. So if you're going to report and do deep digging into a decision made in your state capital or your nation's capital, and you're a local paper, you don't have the kind of money to assign a reporter to spend a couple months on something. It's just, you just can't afford it. And that's the problem. And those local newspapers don't have the revenue stream anymore that they once had. And yet it's a terrible cost to democracy because local citizens depend on that information.
Absolutely. And yet you shouldn't need to pay for the truth, should you? Because in the past it was paid by advertising dollars. The advertising dollars kept those smaller newspapers alive. So yeah, it is. I completely agree with you there. Ken, if we look back into your younger days, what really ignited your passion for wanting to be a journalist? Was it something you always wanted to do, or how did that develop?
I have a graduate degree in political science. And I thought initially, I always wrote for my school undergraduate and graduate newspaper and magazines, literary magazine stuff. And I always liked that. But I thought I wanted to be in government. I wanted to make the world a better place, blah, 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 blah. And I started out working in government and politics. I didn't know whether I wanted to be a state diplomat, or I didn't want to run for office or anything, but I wanted to be. And I did that the first 10 or so years of my professional life. But I liked writing. I liked the freedom and independence you felt if you could succeed at it. And so eventually, I wound up I was campaign manager for a guy by the name of Howard Samuels, a wonderful man, a businessman, who was running for governor of New York. And I was campaign manager. And with my help, he went from a 20-point lead to a 20-point defeat. So I was suddenly out of work. And I said, I really want to see if I could. I had done some journalism in that 10-year period as well. I want to see if I could make a career out of that. And fortunately, the woman I was living with, who's now my wife, she had a job. And so I could afford to write a piece for the Village Voice or Connecticut Magazine for $300 and over several weeks work. And eventually it kind of congealed, and I had some success.
And now you're a master of the craft, I think, after all those years. I am very conscious of time, Ken, and I know your time is precious. So unfortunately, I have a lot more questions for you, but we're going to have to round it up. Is there anything, before I leave you, is there anything you can share about what's in store with your writing at the moment, or anything that's coming up for next year that you can share with your readers and our audience?
I just finished a biography of Harvey Weinstein, the movie mogul who was tried, and I was at the trial every day in New York, and was convicted and sentenced on March 11th, 2020, to 23 years in prison. He is in prison. He's about to go on trial in Los Angeles for similar charges, rape, abuse of women, et cetera. But in writing about Harvey Weinstein, who was so influential in helping propel the Me Too movement into existence because of his abuse of women. But if you're writing a biography, you're trying to understand, as I said earlier, someone. And we know this man made amazing movies. So I wanted to understand, what was his talent that made those movies? We know this man did horrific abuse of people who worked for him and of women. Where'd that come from? Why? What was this? That was a mystery to me. So I delved into his childhood and his early years to try and understand that, as well as the years in the movie business and why he was successful. And so a biography like that poses many different mysteries that you're trying to uncover. And that keeps you alive, even if you think the person you're writing about did really ugly things and not someone you might want to befriend. But he is interesting. And I try to do that. So there might be people who will say, well, wait, Harvey Weinstein, we shouldn't give him any due. I mean, we shouldn't acknowledge any talent he had or any movies he may have made because he was a monstrous individual. But people are not just one thing. And part of that notion I presented before, the truth is a liquid, not a solid. Well, the liquid moves in wide swatches, and your job as a journalist or an author is to try and convey that complex truth. It doesn't mean that after you write about someone like Harvey Weinstein, you still won't walk away saying, I can't believe the ugly, beastly things he did to other human beings. But hopefully I might be able to explain why he did it and how he did it and how he's paying a price for it, a justifiable price.
Absolutely. That sounds so exciting. And look, I think it does. It adds to our knowledge and it adds to our understanding of the world. So although you mentioned we'll potentially walk away and think, what a monster, as you say, there's a lot of contradictions there. Some of the movies we love the most that were produced by Miramax when Harvey was in charge. So I really look forward to reading that biography, Ken, and my best wishes with it. So thank you so much for our little interview this evening. It's been absolutely fantastic, and thanks again.
Thanks for the good questions.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of In the Frame. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive with Ken Auletta. You can find more of Ken's insightful work in The New Yorker, where he has been a senior contributor for years. Don't miss his 13th book, Hollywood Ending, Harvey Weinstein and the Culture of Silence, published by Penguin Press. This compelling biography explores Weinstein's monstrous behaviour, the culture of silence that protected him, and the nature of his talent. For more information on Ken's work, visit his website at kenauletta.com. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and podcast for more fascinating conversations, and leave a review to let us know what you think. Until next time, I'm Brett Moffatt, and this has been In the Frame. Stay curious and keep exploring.